Let me make it clear, as we have in our discussions, that the United States of America is not only morally but legally responsible for what happens to the 3,400 unarmed civilians in Ashraf. Each one of those civilians has a signed piece of paper by the commander of the United States Armed Forces, which disarmed them in exchange for that piece of paper, which says that we will guarantee their safety. Conditions at Camp Liberty are not satisfactory. By all accounts, by the United Nations Ambassador Kobler, their special representative, by the UNHCR, by the United States, by all accounts. We cannot afford to delay anymore. As Madam Rajavi said, we delayed 5 months. Fortunately, we were able to extend the deadline, the execution deadline that was given by Prime Minister Maliki. I don't want to be in that situation when this deadline expires, which is the end of April. And so I now call on the United States and the United Nations to begin processing refugees in Camp Ashraf so there's no further delay by the Iraqi government.
The deception I speak of begins with the notion, at least I think many of us who have been on these conference calls and in communication with your leadership of the MEK have been under the impression that once that artificial deadline was established, the UN Special Envoy was announced, that there would be a legitimate effort to negotiate a mutually satisfactory agreement between the leadership of the MEK and the United Nations and the Iraqi government to provide for the safety and security of the residents of the camp. That was the impression that was given. Many of us felt there would be shuttle diplomacy back and forth. The camp, Paris, Baghdad, back and forth, negotiated settlement. Well, that has happened. There has been no negotiation. There has been talk. But the final agreement was not signed by or signed off on, even in a rhetorical way, by the leadership of the MEK. It's a rather deceptive practice to say one thing and do another. Let history record, although there were verbal assurances of the safety and security of the residents, it is not embedded in the agreement. There was one trip to Paris, one trip to Baghdad, and then it was a fait accompli. Here's the memorandum of understanding. Take it or leave it. Mrs. Rajavi, courageous, principled leadership on your part, convincing the residents to rely on you, and I might say to rely on the word of the United States. As unsatisfactory as that memorandum of understanding may be, as disingenuous as they may have been in suggesting that would be negotiated, you have called upon them to trust you, trust us, trust the international community, trust the UN, and trust the United States. Take the agreement and live by it. Principled, courageous, but there's still more work to do. They've made the single largest concession possible in order to avoid another massacre. They've agreed to be relocated to Camp Liberty. At one time they thought it was a military camp. They thought it was of massive size, and all of a sudden it has been compressed to a small area around which they are building walls, which doesn't sound like a resettlement camp. It sounds more like a prison. And we must demand that the U.S. and the UN live up to those promises made early on in the discussions about humane conditions at Camp Liberty, the preservation and protection of privacy. We do have 1,000 women.
And then we didn't ask a second question. Why relocate out of Camp Ashraf at all? Why? What was wrong? What harm was being done to the Iraqi government by having these 3,400 people live peacefully, controlling their own destiny, paying for their own expenses, living peacefully, endangering and threatening no one in this camp? Why was it necessary to move them? Why couldn't the HCR have done its work in Camp Ashraf. We were told that was unacceptable, but nobody told us why. And think about it. What possible reason was relocation necessary? Why couldn't the goals, if the Iraqis are honest, that they want these people out, why couldn't it have been done in Camp Ashraf? Why didn't we ask that question? And getting no good answer, why didn't we just have a little backbone and say, no, they're staying in Ashraf until the relocation process is done? We didn't ask that question. But it's time to ask the Iraqis why. Why we went from a 40-kilometer base to a less than 1 kilometer base. What was the reason for it? Was there any good reason? Was it necessary to protect Iraqi security? Was it necessary for intelligence purposes? What was the reason that we reduced the size? There is no good answer. What was the reason, even though the MOU specifically lays out the fact that the residents have the right to take all of their movable assets and adequate vehicles to Camp Liberty? What's the reason that they're saying no now? They're saying no now. Did we ask? Did the UN ask? Did the State Department ask? Did anybody ask why? Why are you doing this in violation of the MOU that the Iraqi government signed? But if, in fact, the Iraqis' goal is to turn this into a prison, if, in fact, their actions are no more than punitive to the residents of Ashraf, if, in fact, that punitive action is no more than an attempt to appease Tehran again, if, in fact, that's the case, then the UN and the United States of America have to use the word no to relocation.
The reason for recalling this now is that Iraqi forces are the forces who are supposed to be relied on under the Memorandum of Understanding to maintain order and to protect the residents of Ashraf. That memorandum has many weaknesses. The United States is not a signatory. The memo itself was signed without the approval of the MEK, and Mrs. Rajavi was asked only after the fact to encourage residents of Ashraf to move to Camp Liberty in reliance on it. And as we have all come to know, even the physical accommodations at Camp Liberty are not yet adequate to sustain anyone, when such elementary facilities as electricity and running water are not yet available. And the Iraqis keep reducing the size of the available space that the residents of Ashraf may occupy, and it's now down to less than 2 kilometers from the 40 originally suggested. And it's become increasingly apparent that the accommodations at Camp Liberty will most closely resemble those of a prison. The residents of Ashraf are being increasingly restricted in the possessions that they can take with them.
We asked, why can't the UN interview these refugee candidates in Camp Ashraf? And we get the amazing and preposterous response back that the UN won't conduct the interviews there because they think it's an intimidating atmosphere. Well, if you look at what they're doing at Camp Liberty, I can't conceive of a more intimidating atmosphere, with police inside the compound, UN observers outside the compound, no U.S. observers, a small, tiny facility with no infrastructure. When Ambassador Kobler signed that MOU on December 25th, did he not know that there was no infrastructure in Camp Liberty? There was no plumbing, there was no electric, there was no basis to move anybody in there, even if you were creating a prison.
The United Nations is a culture of its own. I know how it operates. I understand why there are difficulties with dealing with the UN assistance mission in Iraq, in part because it sees itself as accredited to the government of Iraq. Part of its objective is to make sure it gets along with the government of Iraq. So I think it's very important, as Madam Rajavi and others negotiate with Ambassador Kobler, that those who want an equitable and correct result for Camp Ashraf understand what needs to be done to persuade the ambassador and the UN bureaucracy in New York that their principal responsibility is not making the government of Iraq happy. It's protecting the residents of Camp Ashraf. Camp Ashraf is not a problem. Camp Ashraf is an interim solution. And how tragic it would be, what a stain on the reputation of this Nobel Peace Prize winning agency to preside over a degradation in the living status and freedom and welfare of refugees. I just really don't think if the West and others put appropriate pressure on UNHCR that Commissioner Gutierrez really wants that to happen. And I think it's important that he understand that.